I've been sitting on this for almost 2 months now, trying to convince myself there was a logical explanation, but I can't shake what happened to me at Fort Riley. It's weird finally typing this out, but I need to tell somebody who won't immediately think I'm losing my mind. I'm a staff sergeant with the Army, and back in June, I was temporarily stationed at Fort Riley, Kansas for some cross-training exercises. They had me working in this administrative building near one of the small airfields on base. It's an older facility, not ancient, but definitely built several decades ago, probably 1970s from the look of it. Lots of beige walls, tile flooring, and that institutional feel military buildings always have. I was only supposed to be there for 8 weeks, handling logistics paperwork for an upcoming exercise. My temporary office was in the main section of the building, just a desk in a corner with a computer, nothing special. There was another building connected to ours by a short walkway where they kept the break room, vending machines, and some other offices. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon, around 3 o'clock. I remember the time clearly because I'd been staring at my computer for hours and my eyes were starting to burn. I decided to take a break and grab a soda from the vending machine in the other building. The weather that day was brutal, 98 degrees with humidity that made it feel like you were swimming through soup. The air conditioning in both buildings was struggling to keep up, making that constant hum that becomes white noise after a while. I walked down the hallway, through the connecting passage, and into the other building. Something felt off right away. Usually, there were at least a few people walking around, but that afternoon it was completely silent. No conversation, no phones ringing, not even the sound of keyboards clicking. I figured maybe people were in a meeting or something. The break room was about halfway down the main corridor. I stuck my head in, empty, walked over to the vending machine, got my Diet Coke, and cracked it open right there. The carbonation hiss echoed loudly in the silent room. I took a long drink and decided to head back to my desk. This is where things get weird. I walked back toward the main entrance of the building, which had these double glass doors. They were the heavy commercial kind with metal frames and push bars, but the glass panels were large enough that you could clearly see your reflection as you approached. I was maybe 10 feet from the doors when I noticed my reflection in the glass. Nothing unusual at first, just me in my ACUs walking toward the exit. But then I realized there was another reflection behind mine, not like way back in the hallway, but directly behind me. Close enough that this person should have been practically breathing down my neck. It was definitely a human figure, about my height, wearing what looked like a dark uniform. The reflection wasn't super clear, but clear enough that I could make out a person. My brain didn't even register fear at first, just confusion. I automatically reached for the door handle and held it open, thinking whoever was behind me would want to exit too. When nobody walked through, I turned around to see who it was. There was nobody there. The hallway behind me was completely empty. I'm not ashamed to admit I freaked out a little. I let the door close and spun around in a full circle, scanning the hallway. Nothing. No doors closing nearby, no sound of footsteps, just the hum of the AC. I even checked behind a nearby water fountain, thinking maybe someone was playing a prank. My heart was racing now. I pushed through the door and practically jogged back to my office building. I kept looking over my shoulder the entire way. When I got back to my desk, I must have looked spooked because Davis, one of the permanent staff sergeants who worked there, asked if I was okay. I hesitated before telling him what happened. In the military, you don't want to be the person claiming to see things that aren't there. But his reaction surprised me. He didn't laugh or look concerned about my mental health. Instead, he nodded and asked, "You saw someone in the reflection that wasn't actually there, right?" The hair on my arm stood up. "How did you know?" Davis glanced around to make sure nobody was listening, then rolled his chair closer to my desk. "That building has a history. A lot of us have experienced things over there, especially when you're alone." He explained that the building had been there since World War II, though it had been renovated several times since. During the war, part of it had served as a temporary morgue. where they'd keep the bodies of soldiers before processing them for burial or transport back home. "We don't really talk about it with new people," Davis said. "Not unless they experience something first. Otherwise, you just sound crazy, right?" He told me other stories, people hearing footsteps when nobody was around, doors opening and closing on their own, and yes, reflections of people who weren't there. Apparently, it happened often enough that long-time personnel just accepted it as part of working at Fort Riley. I tried to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe it was a trick of the light, or a reflection of furniture that my brain misinterpreted as a person. I went back later that afternoon, trying to recreate the conditions. I stood in the same spot, looking at my reflection in the door glass. There was nothing behind me that could have created that illusion. No furniture, no shadows, nothing. That night in my temporary quarters, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing that reflection in my mind. The dark uniform, the human shape standing impossibly close behind me. I started researching Fort Riley's history on my phone. The base has been active since 1853 and has seen its share of tragedy. During World War II, thousands of soldiers trained there before shipping out to Europe and the Pacific. Many never returned. The next day, I asked around discreetly about the building. An older civilian employee who'd worked on base for over 20 years confirmed what Davis had told me. She said the east wing of that building had indeed been used as a temporary morgue during World War II. They'd bring the bodies in through what's now the loading dock, she explained during a smoke break. Sometimes they'd have dozens waiting for processing. The families would be notified, then the bodies would be prepared for burial. It wasn't like today, where they'd be shipped home right away. She also mentioned that the building had been used as a medical facility during the Korean War, though not specifically as a morgue during that time. "Do you believe in ghosts?" I asked her. She took a long drag on her cigarette. "I believe there are things we can't explain. I've worked here a long time, and that building has always felt occupied." For the next few days, I found excuses not to go back to that building alone. I'd ask someone to walk with me, or I'd time my breaks to coincide with the busiest periods when I knew others would be around. By Friday, though, I was starting to feel stupid about the whole thing. I'm a grown man, a staff sergeant in the United States Army. I've been deployed to combat zones. I couldn't let myself be scared of an empty building in broad daylight. So around 2:30 that afternoon, I forced myself to go back for a coffee. This time, there were a few people in the break room, which made me feel better. I chatted with them briefly, got my coffee, and headed back toward the exit. As I approached those same glass doors, I felt my pulse quickening. I deliberately kept my eyes down, not wanting to look at the reflection, but as I reached for the handle, something made me look up. There it was again, my reflection, and behind me, the dark figure. This time, I could make out more details. It was definitely a man in what looked like an old-style military uniform. Not modern ACUs like mine, but something older. His face was shadowed, but I could tell he was looking directly at me through the reflection. I froze with my hand on the door handle. I could hear people talking in the break room behind me, maybe 30 feet down the hallway, but according to the reflection, this figure was standing inches behind me. I forced myself to turn around slowly. Empty space. Nothing but air where the reflection showed a solid person. I pushed through the door and walked quickly back to my building, cold sweat breaking out across my back despite the heat. This time, I didn't tell anyone. What was I supposed to say? That I'd seen it again? That it looked more solid, more real this time? I'd sound completely unhinged. Over the weekend, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I researched cases of hauntings on military bases and found dozens of stories, many from places with long histories like Fort Riley. Some people claimed these phenomena increased during times of conflict, as if the spirits of soldiers past became more restless when new generations were being sent to war. By Monday, curiosity was starting to overcome my fear. I had just 5 more days at Fort Riley before returning to my permanent station. If there was something supernatural happening in that building, I wanted to understand it better. I decided to go back one more time, but with purpose. I borrowed a digital thermometer from the maintenance office, claiming I needed to check the temperature in my workspace. I also brought my phone to take pictures. Around 3:15 that afternoon, I walked back to the other building. It was fairly busy this time, with several people moving through the hallways. I went to the break room, pretended to get a drink, then positioned myself near the exit doors. I held up my phone like I was checking messages, but angled it so I could take photos of the door reflection. I took several shots, trying to be casual about it. A couple of people walked by and nodded to me, but otherwise paid no attention. As the hallway cleared out again, I felt that same heaviness in the air I'd noticed before. I turned toward the glass doors, and there he was again in the reflection, the figure standing behind me. This time, he was even clearer. The uniform looked like World War II era, and though his face was still indistinct, I could make out that he was young, probably in his 20s. My hands were shaking as I tried to take a photo of the reflection. The thermometer in my pocket was beeping. The temperature around me had dropped nearly 15 degrees in seconds. Then something happened that makes me shudder even now as I type this. In the reflection, the soldier raised his hand and placed it on my shoulder. I felt it. Not just saw it in the reflection, but physically felt the weight and pressure of a hand on my right shoulder. It wasn't aggressive or threatening. It felt almost like a gesture of camaraderie, the way a fellow soldier might rest a hand on your shoulder. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I stood there with this invisible hand on my shoulder, staring at the reflection that showed what I couldn't see when I turned my head. After what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds, the pressure lifted. In the reflection, the soldier stepped back, gave a small nod, and then simply faded away. I left immediately, my legs barely carrying me back to my office. The photos on my phone showed nothing but my own reflection. The thermometer had recorded the temperature drop, but that could be explained by walking near an AC vent. I spent my remaining days at Fort Riley avoiding that building completely. I made excuses, sent others to get things for me, anything to avoid going back there. I'm back at my permanent station now, and I still haven't told many people about what happened. Who would believe me? But I know what I saw. I know what I felt. And I keep wondering about that soldier. Who he was, why he's still there, and why he chose to make himself known to me. I don't know if I'll ever go back to Fort Riley. Part of me hopes I never do, but another part wonders if he's still there, appearing in reflections, placing phantom hands on the shoulders of passing soldiers. Sometimes I catch myself looking at reflective surfaces, half expecting to see someone standing behind me. I still don't have an explanation for what happened, and honestly, I don't think I ever will. Story 21. I still don't know how to explain what happened that morning. It's been 3 years, and I've barely told anyone because it sounds completely insane. But I need to get this off my chest, and maybe someone here has seen something similar. My husband James and I had just moved into our first house in Millfield about a month before it happened. We were so excited. I was 22, he was 24, and we felt like real adults finally having our own place. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small 2-bedroom with a decent yard for our dog, Max. The neighborhood was nice and quiet, mostly older folks who'd been there for decades. The only thing that stood out was the church across the street and down about half a block. You could hear the music on Sunday mornings if our windows were open. James worked at a manufacturing plant about 40 minutes away, and his buddy Rick would pick him up around 5 in the morning. I'd always wake up with him and walk him to the curb to wait. It sounds silly, but it was our little routine, me in my robe and slippers, half asleep, but wanting those extra few minutes together before he left for 12 hours. The morning it happened started like any other. Our alarm went off at 4:30. James showered while I made coffee, and Max did his usual morning patrol of the backyard. It was mid-October, so it was still completely dark outside when we stepped out the front door at about 10 minutes to 5. I remember it was unusually cold that morning. I had wrapped my robe tighter around myself and was holding James's travel mug while he locked the door. Max was with us. He always came out for the morning send-off. As we walked down our short driveway, James suddenly stopped. "Do you see that?" he asked, pointing toward the church. The church had these lampposts that stayed on all night, creating pools of yellow light around the property. In one of these circles of light near the front entrance, I could see what looked like dogs walking in a weird pattern. "It's just strays looking for food," I said, not thinking much of it. There were always cats and sometimes dogs wandering around the neighborhood. James frowned. "Why are they walking in a circle like that?" I squinted to see better in the darkness. There were 3 or 4 dog-shaped figures moving in what did look like a deliberate circle, but I still wasn't alarmed. "Maybe someone threw food and they're sniffing around for it," I suggested. Though even as I said it, I realized it didn't make much sense. We stood at the curb waiting for Rick, and James kept watching the dogs. After a few minutes, he seemed to forget about it as we talked about what we needed from the grocery store that weekend. Rick pulled up, James kissed me goodbye, and that was that. I went back inside, crawled into bed, and didn't think about the dogs again until the next morning. I remember every detail of what happened next. It was exactly 4:52 in the morning. I know because I checked my phone right before we stepped outside. It was even colder than the day before, and there was this weird stillness in the air. No breeze, no distant traffic sounds, nothing. The second we opened our front door, every dog in the neighborhood started barking. Not just regular barking, it was frantic, almost panicked. Max, who was usually pretty chill, suddenly planted himself in front of me, his fur standing straight up. He was trying to push me back into the house with his body. "What's wrong with him?" James asked, trying to nudge Max aside so we could get down the steps. That's when I looked toward the church again. In that same pool of light, I saw them. At first it was just one, then another appeared from behind the church, then a third, and finally a fourth. They were shaped like dogs, or at least that's what my brain first registered them as. But something was off. Their movements were too fluid, too coordinated. They were walking in that same circular pattern, but now I could see that their noses were pointed upward, as if they were sniffing the air above them. "James," I whispered, grabbing his arm. "Look!" He was already staring in that direction, his body completely tense. "I see them." Max was whimpering now, still trying to herd me back into the house. I should have been scared. Everything about the situation screamed danger. But for some reason, I felt unnaturally calm. Like I was watching everything through a thick pane of glass. The largest of the dog things, which stood just above my waist height, and I'm only 5 feet tall, suddenly broke from the circle. It remained in the light, but stopped moving. Then it turned its head directly toward us. I couldn't make out its features clearly at that distance, but I knew it was looking right at us. I could feel it. It stood there, staring, for what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds. Then it moved toward a large oak tree at the edge of the church property. It disappeared behind the trunk momentarily, and when something emerged from the other side, it wasn't a dog anymore. What stepped out was a tall, black figure. It was humanoid, but wrong somehow. Too tall, too thin. It had to be 7 or 8 feet in height. I couldn't see a face or features, just this dark silhouette against the lamplight. It stood there for a few seconds, looking directly at us, and then it stepped back behind the tree. The dog thing reappeared and rejoined the circle. "What the fuck?" James whispered. His voice was shaking. "What the actual fuck was that?" I couldn't answer. My mouth had gone completely dry, and that unnatural calmness was still washing over me, making everything seem distant and unreal. The headlights of Rick's truck suddenly swept across the street as he turned the corner. When the beams hit the circle of dog things, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. Their eyes didn't reflect the light. Normal dogs' eyes will glow when light hits them, but these just looked like empty sockets, absorbing the light rather than reflecting it. Max was still pushing against my legs, his whimpering growing more urgent. James was frozen beside me, his breathing shallow and rapid. "We need to go inside," I finally said, my voice sounding strange and far away to my own ears. "Rick's here," James replied, but he made no move toward the truck that was now idling at our curb. "Tell him you're sick, please, James." Rick honked once, briefly. The sound seemed to snap James out of his trance, and he looked at me with wide eyes. Yeah, I'll tell him I'm sick." He walked stiffly to the truck, leaned in the passenger window and spoke to Rick for a moment. I saw Rick nod, and then the truck pulled away. As soon as James returned to my side, I grabbed his hand and practically dragged him back into the house. Max bolted in ahead of us, and I slammed the door shut, locking it immediately. We stood in our darkened entryway, both of us breathing hard. "Did you see that?" James asked. "Tell me you saw that too." "I saw it," I confirmed, my artificial calmness finally starting to crack. "What was it? What were those things?" James moved to the living room window that faced the church and peered through the blinds. "They're still there, still walking in that circle." I couldn't bring myself to look. Instead, I sank down onto our couch, my mind racing to make sense of what we'd just witnessed. "Maybe they're just dogs," I said weakly. "Maybe the other thing was just a person walking their dog." A 7-foot-tall person who disappeared behind a tree and turned back into a dog. James's voice had an edge of hysteria to it now. "Did you see their eyes? They didn't have any." Max was pacing nervously between us, still whimpering occasionally. I reached down to pet him, trying to calm both him and myself. "We should call someone," James said. "And say what? That we saw shape-shifting dog monsters outside the church?" Even as I said it, I knew how ridiculous it sounded. "They'll think we're crazy or on drugs." James joined me on the couch, and we sat in silence for a while. Eventually, he spoke again. "Why weren't you scared? You looked so calm out there." I hadn't realized he'd noticed. I don't know. I felt weird, like I was watching everything happen to someone else, like it wasn't real. I paused, thinking, "Why were you so scared?" "Because it was fucking terrifying," he exclaimed. "Those weren't dogs, Rebecca. And that thing that came out from behind the tree, it was looking right at us. It knew we were watching." We stayed inside all day. James called in sick to work, and I cancelled my shift at the cafe where I worked part-time. We kept the blinds closed and jumped at every sound. Max refused to go outside, even into our fenced backyard. By that evening, we'd convinced ourselves that we'd seen something with a logical explanation. Maybe it was some weird church ritual with people in costumes. Maybe we were both overtired and imagined the worst. Maybe it was a prank. But deep down, I knew none of those explanations fit what we'd seen. The next morning, we didn't go outside at 5. James called Rick and arranged to be picked up at the corner instead of in front of our house. We left together at 5:30, when the sky was just starting to lighten, and we didn't look toward the church. We never spoke about it again after that week. Not really. Sometimes James would make a reference to that weird morning, but we never discussed the details. We stopped our morning routine. I'd still get up with him, but we'd say goodbye at the door, and within 6 months, we'd put the house up for sale and move to an apartment across town. I still don't know what we saw that morning. I've researched local folklore, asked subtle questions to neighbors and church members, even looked into the history of the land the church was built on. Nothing explains what we witnessed. The strangest part? Every time I drive past that church now, I feel that same unnatural calmness wash over me, like something is trying to tell me not to be afraid, and somehow that's the most terrifying part of all.